Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. My guest today is Arnold. He is the author of Cuba-U.S. Relations, published in 2018. He's also a journalist and a contributing editor to Canada Files and International Manifesto Group member. Thank you for joining us today, Arnold.
It's always a pleasure to be with you. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you. Now,
that's great.
The world is on edge, anticipating this latest clash between U.S. and Russia. But for us, for our purpose, I'd like to focus our interview on what this means for countries in Latin America that have been under the foot of U.S. imperialism and that have been in some way sheltered by the presence of Russia supporting them in some way. So specifically, we're talking about Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. So how do you see this conflict? How do you see it unfolding?
Yeah, from the Latin American perspective, I guess. I'm glad that you asked that question because I believe it is not dealt with enough. Just to give you some context, if I may. Some people say, well, Biden is not keeping his promise, electoral promise and all that. That's not true. With regards to Latin America, his main promise was the following. Unlike Trump, I'm going to stand up to dictators like Maduro and Miguel Diaz-Canel and Cuba, or Castro. Of course, he doesn't know that Castro passed away. So where we are at now with regards to Latin America is that he has been fulfilling this promise, to the right of Trump, going after Venezuela and Cuba. Let's go back one step with regards to Russia. People are talking about the war in Ukraine or Russian war or whatever. The war, yes, there is a war, but it was started in 2014 by the United States and its allies with the coup d'etat, Maidan coup d'etat in that year, which overthrew the democratically elected president, and in its place installed the puppet government. So that's where it all started, as you pointed out. Now, going back to Latin America once again, I don't know if you noticed that, but a short while ago, I think 2-3 days ago, Biden's advisor for international affairs regarding the hemisphere that is Latin America, he made this astonishing statement. He said, in an interview, I'm paraphrasing it, of course, he said, well, the sanctions against Russia are not only against Russia, they are also to weaken Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. So there you go. I mean, it's another important point for people to take into account if they too easily accept the issue of Russian aggression or Russian imperialism. I mean, we know that Russia is not communist. We know that it's capitalist and all that. So there's no point going into that. But the fact is, Sylvia, in my view, Russia plays a positive role in the international sphere by allying itself with Iran, with China, in order to oppose the hegemonic unipolar world which the United States continues to aim to apply to the world. And so, in this pushback against the unipolar world, Russia, China, and Iran, for example, also ally themselves, assist especially countries such as Venezuela and Cuba. I think back often when people who are so-called progressive, they say, "Oh no, Russia is bad. It's carrying out aggression against the Ukraine." But it's the same Russia who, when Cuba really needed help a few months ago as a result of the very stringent sanctions against Cuba in the course of the pandemic, who sent assistance to Cuba? It was Russia. I remember speaking to a friend of mine in Havana. I always speak with them to sort of keep track of the situation, and he said that we really like the way that when Biden threatened Russia, what did Putin do? Said, the hell with you, I'm sending a plane load of material, goods, and medications to Cuba, and he's done that several times. And Iran, for example, has helped Venezuela a lot to kickstart the oil industry in Venezuela by supplying Venezuela with the type of oil that Venezuela needs in order to refine their own oil, which is not good enough for exporting. So with this help, not only did this high-grade oil being shipped to Iran, I just read recently, 2-3 days ago, it has also rekindled the exportation of Venezuelan oil to Cuba. I'm glad that you raised the issue of Latin America. In evaluating Russia and all that with Ukraine, one has to take into account the overall situation, the role of Russia in alliance with other countries.
Mm. One of the things that I find most alarming, is, as you point out, this didn't start now. It started back in 2014 with the coup in Ukraine and Yanukovych being taken out of power, right?
Right.
But now we also know that the U.S. has been the empire since 1989, with integration of Eastern Europe. There was agreements signed that they would not expand NATO, which is the military arm of empire, right, of the U.S. empire.
Right.
And so when we think about this idea of, they just want to integrate Ukraine to NATO, they're just promoting democracy, this language confuses people because they think, of course we should be in support of democracy, of course we should be in support of that. But what they don't see is how this really translates, right? For us in Latin America, the so-called promotion of democracy has been the expansion of neoliberalism, has been the expansion of this constant cutting of social services and safety networks and creating life completely unbearable for the average person. And this is why the Venezuelans had a beautiful revolution that they call, a revolution to move away from capitalism to one that is more socialistic oriented, where people have access to their resources, not just serve as a plundering land for empire. So enter into the equation, right, the need of empire to constantly have this control, not just of the lands, the people, but also their economic systems. The Russia conflict is also about EU expansion, which is about westernized ways of commerce and capitalism. So can you talk a little bit about the way that this not only challenges the vision that perhaps Venezuelans or Cubans have about moving their societies from bridal capitalism into a more socially oriented way of organizing economics?
On the issue of Russia, if we could have taken a snapshot of the world a couple of months ago before the conflict broke out, objectively, Russia would like to have have signed agreements in order to have deeper relations with, for example, China. They've had military agreements, economic and commercial agreements. So the United States, as you said, they cannot afford to have a strong Russia in the eastern part of Asia that is able to foster good economic and political commercial links with countries such as China, as well as, for example, with Iran. Their main issue, they want to weaken Russia. So Russia is hindered in its ongoing attempt to forge economic and political links with China and Iran. I don't know if it's going to work, but in any case, it's definitely going to backfire, because while they wanted Russia to not form these alliances without taking account the United States, in fact, these alliances are going to be stronger and to develop even further. Now, with regards to socialism, of course, Russia is not socialist. But, so what? The main thing is, does it play a positive role in the international sphere or not? Yes, I believe so. The facts show that they are pushing back against U.S. hegemony. Now, what about China? China, in my view, it is a socialist country. It has its own features of socialism based on its own history and its own characteristics. And I think anyone watching the news, even the capitalist news, it's hard to avoid the fact that China, since the pandemic, has emerged as an important economic force, and also a social force, because the way they took care of the issue of COVID-19 is far superior than the capitalist system. For example, in the United States and Canada and other countries, and therefore, like it or not, people are looking to China as a possible alternative, as you mentioned, in terms of organizing social system. I mean, it was very interesting. The Olympics. I don't know if you watched some of the Olympics, the opening and closing ceremony and all that, but it was really impressive. I mean, United States and we're going to boycott it. We're not going to send our diplomats, and this type of thing. Who the hell cares? It was a success. One cannot deny that it was a success. It was a beautiful thing to see, and is another indication of what a country based on its own version of socialism can do. And other countries such as Venezuela and Cuba, despite all the difficulties, and Nicaragua, are attempting to develop the socialism in their respective countries. Is it perfect? No. Is it difficult to do? Of course it is. Cuba and Venezuela have deadly sanctions being carried out against them. Of course, it's very difficult to develop the economic and social system, but the fact is that these type of systems that we have in Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, are the type of systems that people in the North, if they knew about it, would like to have. I mean, you cannot hide the fact that Cuba has developed its own vaccines against COVID-19. There's a lot of collaboration between, on the one hand, Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua with regards to supplying foods, regard to supplying anti-COVID-19 vaccination. So I think you're right. Despite the turmoil that's going on in the world, people have to think seriously about the important role that these countries play. I don't think you could import a Cuban or a Venezuelan or a Chinese model to Canada. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what you said, the idea to organize a system that is not based on savage capitalism. And China is such a system. Sure, there's capitalists in China, but they control these capitalists. If they get out of hand, I see many reports they're tried and sent to jail. So that's really good, isn't it? So this, despite everything, this turmoil, we still see those countries in the south, especially such as Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and other countries, are developing its own system, its own social system, and not as a model, but we have to take this into account, that another world is possible that is not based on savage capitalism, such as in the United States of America.
The other part of this that I think can be inspiring in some ways is the fact that we learn from our struggles. Cuba has become, in so many ways, a vision of inspiration for many countries, because despite being so little, despite being right in the belly of the beast, if you were,
right.
they're thriving as a society. They have, their literacy has skyrocketed. They have more doctors than other nations can dream of. They're very advanced. And we're seeing similar movements within Venezuela, where people are becoming very, resilient, in the ways that they address the multiple incursions that they have tried to do to bring down their government. So what I see happening is the U.S. losing whatever slim credibility they had, right? Because they have a very powerful media that promotes this idea that they're the good guy and everybody else is, they're bringing something, democracy and peace to the world, where in reality, they're the warmongering. And we in Latin America have experienced that firsthand. So it's really hard to convince people in Latin America of that. But perhaps there are other people outside in other parts of the world who believe their rhetoric. So what I see is not only the U.S. Losing that sense of, I see NATO losing its whatever notion they had that they were a security force. The world is safe, in the U.S. especially. There's no threat to the U.S. There's nothing threatening the U.S., and yet they're aggressing everywhere. So as we move forward, how do you see the social movements within our countries individually perhaps strengthening their own ability to perhaps join with others locally, perhaps even growing in their networks, because this kind of aggression just sends signals to everybody that it's not safe to have one empire, one unipolar world.
I'm glad that you mentioned the role of the media. I don't know what you think. You're, an expert on media, working, to develop in a very consistently over a few decades now, an alternative media. Now, I don't know about you. I have never seen a media blitz against another country and against another leader as we're experiencing now against Russia and Putin. It's terrible. It is 24 hours a day, wall-to-wall coverage, how Russia is bad. I noticed one thing. At one point I saw in the byline, I think it was CNN or CBC, in any case, it's the same, right? They said that Russia has vowed that they will kill the families of any Ukrainians who fight against Russia. But they don't say where that comes from. They just mention it. They don't even pretend to say that it comes from such and such a source, and okay, we have to check it out. They just blurt it out. And there's so many examples of it. And, I think it's worthwhile to take one extra second for people to explain to people. One has to be very careful about media. I think Malcolm X once said, and he was right, he said, if you don't watch out, the media will have you hating the people that you should love and loving those forces that you should hate, such as the capitalist system, such as the governments of the United States and Canada. This is exactly what is happening now. It is really a very important blitzkrieg, and I think it's important that we oppose it. And, because what is at stake, we mentioned at the beginning that what the Secretary Biden's advisor for the Western Hemisphere said, that these sanctions against Russia are also meant to weaken Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. It's not a small point. So even though Russia is not capitalist, we know that, the weakening of Russia goes against the striving of the peoples of the world, especially, for example, in Latin America, to further develop their socialist system. Now, within Canada, hopefully, for example, especially I have in mind the native indigenous nations in Canada that should realize that they cannot be tied to the Canadian state, cannot be tied to the Canadian Parliament, that they have to develop their own revolutionary struggle against the state in alliance with other people in Canada against that colonial state. Now, I noticed that when the struggle broke out across Canada against the pipeline just before the pandemic hit, which I believe is March 2020, right? Just before that, the country was virtually in a standstill. The main slogan at that time, you will recall, was "Shut Canada Down," and it was being shut down. The only thing that stopped it from being shut down was the pandemic. So people weren't able to man the blockades and the barricades that they set up. So people talk a lot, the native, the demands of the native nations, the native people, but they don't, they cannot avoid showing that photo of the native people in British Columbia holding up very proudly their sign, reconciliation is dead, we want a revolution. It's not a minor point that they're making, this is important. We have to encourage this, we have to support this and all that, along with the working class, with the unions, which I think have to take a very important stand against the Trudeau government and against the political system and the social system. But, we'll see how this happens. It's very difficult now. Propaganda against Putin, we know he's capitalist, but behind the scenes, or the real nature of the anti-Putin, anti-Russian, hysterical disinformation is also anti-communist, because they make sure that people associate Putin with communism and socialism because from Russia. He's in Russia, even though, of course, he is not. So they have it both ways. They know it's not communist. They know that it's capitalist, but the innuendo is always there. We have to oppose that that Russian domination. They're based on the Soviet Union and all that. So it's a very serious situation, and hopefully the outlets such as your outlet, which is very important, gets more support from across the country, so people help people to see through the massive disinformation which is going on now, so people can reach their own conclusion. Hey, the pandemic showed us something. The capitalist system is not able to take care of the most basic needs of the people, and that is health. How many people died or passed away or whatever, or forgotten in different health institutions across Canada. Not to mention the very dire straits of the native indigenous peoples in Canada with regards to COVID-19. So now is the time for people to think, well, this system is no good, so we have to look for an alternative. And I share your point of view that we have to see how we can help people to see through what's happening now and develop a further notion that an alternative is necessary. A better world is possible.
The other part of this conflict is that it comes at a very opportune time for Biden. Biden has been dragging in the polls, and if anyone had any illusion that he was an alternative to Trump, that illusion had gone. And now he gets to be the war president. And now suddenly everybody rallies and they forget that, all the other promises, right? The promise of eradicating poverty or alleviating poverty, housing, education, health. Here in Canada, similar story, right? Only a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister was dragging in the polls again, right? Because of his stand against, people resisting this lockdowns and regulations. We in British Columbia were promised, this Prime Minister ran under the banner of, protecting the environment and doing what is, best for Indigenous people. And yet what we're having is Indigenous people being aggressed left, right, and center and fighting against the pipeline that he promised would not happen. And now is like he funded it and bought it, right? So all of this conflict.
By the way, he is an NDP, right? NDP government.
No. I'm talking about Trudeau. Trudeau. But also, I mean, we have been let down on so many fronts. But I think at the national level, the Trudeau government bought a pipeline that he promised would not happen, right? That he ran against.
Right.
So if we are to see the media, right, the coverage he gets is amazing. I've never seen such good PR for a prime minister. If this had been done by Harper, there would have been so many irate, comments. But yet, we seem to go to sleep when it's someone that we identify as being on our team, if you would.
Yes. No, that's very dangerous. That is why, Sylvia, I think I mentioned several times on your show that, in my view, the danger is not the open fascists such as Trump or things like that, or the conservative. The danger are these social democrat type liberals who lull people to sleep when they're looking for an alternative. That is the danger. Not Trump or Harper, or it is Trudeau, the NDP as well, and the Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party. That is the real danger. They historically, Sylvia, these forces, social democrat, they are the ones who facilitate the rise of fascism. This happened before Second World War II, and I see it now, coming up now, that they are actually indirectly facilitating the ascendance of fascism in countries such as Canada and the United States.
What happens when we fall asleep is that we lose the ability to see our own power. And when you get a media that for 2 years has been constantly broadcasting the number of deaths, how many people are dying, without covering the fact that for the past 30 years we have been under neoliberalism, cutting, funding to education, funding to health. We never get to the root cause. We just get to the symptoms, and we report on the symptoms, but without any real answer as to why this is happening. How did it start? How is it possible that China, with billions of people, have dealt with this crisis far better than any other country? How is it possible that Cuba, with all their sanctions and blockades, has been able to keep most of their population well and restore health in a very rapid amount of time, right? So those are questions we need to be asking, and unless we ask those difficult questions, where is the root? What's the root of this? How do we change this? We will be continuously being distracted, right? With one war here and demonizing one people over another. We all cry over Ukraine, which I think is right. I mean, no blood should be shed. I mean, that's not right. Those of us who have experienced war don't condone war of any kind. I don't condone bombing of Ukraine, and I don't condone bombing of Yemen. I think that people should realize the workers all over the world, are aggressed by one evil, and that is this capitalism that is rampant, that is constantly exploiting and plundering not just our soils, our lands, but also our lives. My hope is that out of this will come a renewed commitment to resist the capitalist violence in whatever form it comes, and that we will find new alliances and learn to see each other, not through labels, of liberal or non-liberal, whatever, but just to see, right, that the struggle really is for life, to create life for future generations and for ourselves.
Yes, I fully agree with your optimism, and I will add that when this comes true, that people move to have a critical attitude towards the system and look to alter, people will be very much indebted to the work that you do and other alternative media does in Canada. CBC is just the satellite of U.S. imperialism. So everything they say and do, the body language, the words that they use, the clips that they show, CBC is just like the fifth column of the U.S. corporate media in Canada. It's disgusting to see them at work. It's very good to see you guys at work doing the excellent work that you and other similar outlets do in Canada.
Thank you so much for being with us. For people who want to access your work, how can they reach you?
My website is very simple. It's www.arnoldaugust.com. ARNOLDAUGUST.com.
Thank you again for being with us, Arnold. Take care.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Take care. Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.